partial, all these postdocs that leave before they finish their 2 years, but it's wonderful when they have a great job. Erica Dollhopf she left us to be the director of the Center for Analytics. What's hard? Research and Development Data. That's right. I always forget the last D. For the United Church of Christ, and I mentioned before about we have this strong connection with Candler and with Emory, but we also have a strong connection with the UCC Research Office, as Bill hinted in his comments, but also we had several other connections with them over the decades, and Erica is the most recent. Both of them will be talking about the data set in different ways, and hopefully you'll find it very stimulating. I know I have, as the person who was also in the steering committee and collected the non-denominational research for this project. So take it away, Rich, and we'll go from there.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Scott, for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I need to first acknowledge my debt to Hartford Institute for Religion Research. My first connection came with the release of the 1990 US Religion Census. We invited Bill McKinney to come. It was in New York City, Times Square. We were in a hotel, did a big press release, and Bill probably doesn't remember this, but in the middle of his presentation about the release, you got a little dry throat, coffee, and I had more hair there. I'm sure you wouldn't recognize me. And I was a really young seminary student, and he asked me to come up and read. He pointed and he said, "This is where I'm at. Pick up from here, read a little bit," while he got a little drink and tried to get his throat back. So I read my first sentence, and I read it with feeling. And Bill was miraculously healed and was able to finish the presentation. So that was my first. My second was a call from Carl Dudley, inviting me to one of the Congregational Studies Institutes thing. And Nancy Ammerman was actually kind of the leader of my little group. And then association with Carl and David and Scott with Faith Communities today. I seriously am indebted very much, and your wisdom, I know it helps me to look a lot smarter than I really am, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate your friendship. So what is the Religion Census? It is a count of religious congregations. So we try to count every congregation in the country. Wow. Okay? Yeah. Tired. And Scott here counts a lot of them. So we'll get later, but he counted more than 44,000 non-denominational independent churches, congregations. So again, thank you to his crew here. If you, any students, anyone work on that project? Anyone here? Okay. The second, where it's available, we count the number of people affiliated with those congregations. So it's not available everywhere. There are some groups that all we can count are the congregations, and there's just no data on how many people are affiliated. But it's a pretty small percent, we think, that we're actually missing. So this is the totals. For the 2020, we had 372 religious groups, over 3.5 million congregations, 350,000, and 161 million in the population that we count as, or call adherents. So people affiliated with a congregation. It could be members, they could be attenders, they could, its children, so forth. So this is kind of a history, shows you the number of groups that participated in the studies, as well as the how many congregations, individuals, population, and the percent of the population. You'll notice the percentage of the population that we count as adherents, people affiliated with the congregation, hasn't changed all that much. We've gotten better at counting. I think we're including more groups and therefore more people, but it's less than half of the population, though, that we count as being affiliated with the congregation. So how does this compare with surveys that are self-identification? So the Pew Religious Landscape survey that was done, I think that's really the most recent one that asked people, what is your religion? And just over 70% report some kind of Christian faith, almost 6% some kind of other faith, and then 22.8% that are unaffiliated. A lot of times people are referring to these as the nones, N-O-N-E-S. And they had a small percentage that refused to answer their question. So how does that compare with what we do in counting congregations and people affiliated with congregations? So as a percentage of the population, we only have 43% of the people that are affiliated with a Christian congregation. And I've included, and then 5.7% other faiths, and then we end up with more than half the population not affiliated with the congregation. So really different methodologies. I want to give you that background so you kind of understand what we're looking at then. So the strengths of the US Religion Census are that the data is reported at the county level. So right there, that's something that any of those surveys that ask what is your religion, they cannot get to the county level. Because you'd have to ask so many people. You'd actually have to do a sample county by county. And so county level is really significant. It allows you to compare our data to the US Census, to any data set that's reported at the county level. Health data, crime data, golfing data, whatever you have that's reported at the county level, you can see how religion impacts that or what the relationship is. The other is the time series of the data. And I want to move on a little bit quick because I have way more than what I can present. So if you put it all together, this is kind of the picture that you look at. So we call this religious families. So what we've done here is the Baptists are considered one family. So Southern Baptists, American Baptists, and National Baptists, we put them all together and call them a Baptist family. And you can see the red in the southeast there, that part of that, or the south. One of the things that's changed with this over time, if you've seen this map before from previous studies, that it's getting a little lighter. So the dark colors mean that 50% of all of the population that's affiliated with a congregation, 50% or more is of this family. So the lighter shades, it's really, when you see the map up close, they're hashed kind of lines. That means 25 to 49% of the population, not the population, the adherents. 25 to 49% of the adherents are affiliated with that family. So the brown, you see the Lutherans, is what that is in the north. That is also lightened up. It's not as brown as it used to be. The gray, which is out in Utah, the Latter-day Saints is actually spreading. More counties that are graying out. The Methodists used to have a green band that went through the middle, and that is disappearing on this map. And then you still see that the Catholics are strong in what I call kind of ports of entry into the country. But it's different kind of immigration patterns. You know, the Northeast is Irish, the Louisiana, right, is more French Catholic, the southern Texas, California would be more Hispanic Catholic immigration. But a lot of these are immigration or settlement patterns. The new one is that we've added is a purple color, and it is the non-denominational congregations. And they are starting to become one of the larger, not really a group, but we group them. So one of the larger groups is in several counties. So this is just a graph of groups with 1 million or more adherents. You can see the blue columns over on the right are the change from 2010 to 2020. And you can see there's a lot of negative numbers there. But the Catholic Church increased almost 3 million. Again, a lot of that is due to immigration. And the non-denominational, by far the largest increase in the number of congregations and number of adherents. Now, some of that adherent increase might be artificial, because I think we might have undercounted some in 2010. And we changed our formula for how we estimated some of the numbers. Non-denominational churches, they really don't emphasize membership a whole lot, which is what we have typically used to try to estimate adherence, overall adherence. So we use some attendance data this time to try to estimate their overall adherence. And then couple of the others. Jehovah's Witness is down in the middle of this. They did not report. We did their gain is kind of artificial here too. We used marketing lists to try to include them in 2010. They did not participate themselves. And so in 2010, we only came up with 5,700 plus congregations, but they reported themselves. They provided their own data, this study, and so it shows an increase of 6,500 congregations. And the 3 million there is because we didn't have any data on the number of people affiliated in the 2010 study. So I'm going to move on. So we've worked hard to expand our coverage. So we do special studies on Orthodox bodies, special studies on Amish. Alexi Krindich does the Orthodox groups for us. Amish was done by Joe Donnemeyer, who had been at the Ohio State University. Plain Anabaptist groups is Corey Anderson. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Corey. Of course, Scott did the independent non-denominational. Historically, African American religious groups, I'm going to talk about them next, so I'll skip over that a second. We worked hard to try to get non-Christian faiths. Gordon Melton was the key person in getting us Hindus and Buddhists. And then, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses provided their own data. So African American religious bodies, they've not collected congregational data, at least not centralized. And what we have done is we've purchased a couple marketing lists to try to get an idea of the number of congregations. And then also, the internet is really changing how we do this study. So we are able to go to the internet to find a lot of these congregations. But it's still really difficult to get numbers associated with it. And so that's where The marketing lists have some, they call and they ask how many people are there, and so we get some data, and then we've looked at other data we've had and say, okay, in metropolitan areas of this size, what's the average size of an African American or other kinds of congregations that we have? And so we try to apply some of those numbers. So, anyhow, we identified 22 predominantly African American groups. 19 of them are present in the study, and 3 we just could not find any usable data to be able to include them, not even a count of congregations. So we know they exist, but it's really hard to find them. And so these are the numbers that we have. So just to show you, we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to do this, to try to collect what we can. That's those groups. So the non-Christian groups here, I'll show you just some of those. And then just another map here, it's looking at the largest non-Christian religion by county. You see a lot of pink. Okay, the lighter pinkish color is Baha'i. Baha'i is the only group in the study that doesn't report the number of adherents where their congregations are. They report their adherents where the person actually lives, because they have a registry. And so that's the way that they report their data to us. Their groups meet in homes and other places. They report that, we report that as a congregation, but it's most of the groups, all the other groups, the number of adherents is reported by the location of the congregation. Does that make sense? So Baha'i looks like they've covered a lot. It's because really there's not presence of other groups in those areas. Those other groups don't have congregations in those counties. So Islam is the darker color. You see the Buddhism in the Northeast as well as West. And Colorado, actually this is the first study from the US Religion Census and what was called churches and church membership, its predecessor, that there are 2 counties where Christianity was not the predominant group. This is the first time that that's happened. So the Buddhists claim 2 counties in Colorado. Now, I think what that is, it's really different than what we do. I think they have centers, retreats, things that draw from a wide area that come there, and these are not real populous counties, I think. And so they end up, because we report by the location of where it is, they end up with a lot. And you can see Judaism in the Northeast, but southern Florida, that was surprising to me. I hadn't realized that before. So I had a question about, particularly with the mainline and evangelical denominations, a lot of the losses that are being shown there, how much of that is due to them being in counties where there are population losses? I think a lot of people don't realize how many counties in the US are actually losing population. So between 2010 and 2020, 52% of the counties, more than half, actually lost population. Now, by lost, I mean even -1. So if it's 0 or positive, that's not, that they're not losing. So when I say, this county lost, I basically made 2 groups. You have a loss of -1 or more. But the blue is our counties that are losing population. And I thought, you know, for Methodists, they're strong point. I mean, they have churches in more counties than any other group, but they were really strong in these counties that were losing population. So I wanted to look at some of this. So I just looked at the 5 largest mainline groups, and you can see their change there, all negative as far as congregations and adherence. And I show the last column there on the right is the percent of their counties that are losing population. And the United Methodists really did match the overall total because they're in almost every county. So it actually ended up working out there. But some of the others are not there. They're in fewer of the counties. So this is, let me be clear here, this is not the group, how many counties they've lost. This is the group in a county that has lost population. And I looked at 5 evangelical groups, plus the Nazarenes, because I'm a Nazarene, I gotta do that. We didn't make the top 5, we're close, we're number 8, but okay. So anyhow, you see the numbers there. The Assemblies of God and the Church of the Nazarene were the only 2 groups that showed some gain in congregations and adherence. So I ran correlations to the population change. So, and I was really surprised that I got negative correlations. First of all, I thought they'd be positive correlations. Your population's losing, you're losing. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that. And in fact, maybe where the population just lost a little bit, you've lost a whole bunch. So anyhow, it comes out negative correlations. For the mainline groups, they're all statistically significant. And if you square the correlation coefficient, you get R squared, which it's supposed to tell you how much of the variance is explained by that. Now I've only been using one variable here, right? Population change. But for Presbyterians, it really explained a lot of their loss, right? Their membership loss, population change. But for other groups, not so much. And for Assemblies of God and Nazarenes that had some change, the population change doesn't explain anything as far as the variance in those groups. So this is just another map. I think the maps are the funnest part. This is the last thing I'll show you because I gotta let Erica present here. But I mean, it's the largest Protestant group. So we got rid of Catholics, we got rid of the non-denominational churches, Scott. But here you can see that green is the United Methodist. You can see where their strength is, and when you remove some of the other when you just look at Protestant groups, you see their strength. All right, Erica, you want to come up? I want to say something about the website, but we will have time to do that afterwards.
All right, thank you, Rich. First, I just want to say that I am so delighted to be here and honored to be invited. So Scott mentioned I am a former postdoc here at the Harvard Institute for Religion Research. And actually, I heard a lot about HIRR when I was doing my first postdoc at the Association for Religion Data Archive, also known as HIRR. And before you get your login credentials when you first start there, the job that they typically give you is to check all the links on all the overviews of every single data set on the site, which at the time was about a little over 900. And so I'm looking at all these different studies, and I was like, Harvard Institute for Religion Research, they're doing some really interesting work. And what do you know, a few months later, a postdoc opportunity pops up there. I know about the work now. And so I applied, and I was fortunate to be offered the position, so I came up here. And I really owe a debt of gratitude really to Scott for all of his mentorship and just taking me to meetings where I got to be involved with these different groups, faith communities today, HIRR, the Religious Research Association. All of this was critical for me as I was a postdoc and then applying eventually for my job at the United Church of Christ. And actually one of the things that I was so excited about with my job with the UCC is that I got to continue working with all of these groups that Scott had introduced me to. Because I was lamenting that if I got an academic position, I couldn't be in fact anymore. Like, fact is my favorite thing that I do. And I loved going to HIRR. I loved, I actually initiated US Religion Census meetings because I was carpooling with Scott to RRA, and HIRR was after that, and we had to wait until the US Religion Census meeting was over after HIRR to drive back to Hartford. So I sat in the meeting, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. I would like to be involved with this. So, here, five years later, I'm, on the operations committee of the US Religion Census, I'm president of HIRR, so I truly feel like I owe so much of this to Scott. So thank you, Scott, and just the opportunities that the Harvard Institute for Religion Research has created and continues to create. I'm just deeply, deeply grateful. So today I'm going to be extending some of what Rich talked about. I'm going to be focusing specifically on our adherence data that we had in the US Religion Census. So what I'll be talking about is overall go into a little bit more detail on that definition of adherence that we use. And then I'm going to look at these trends at a few different levels. So I'll look at this at a national level, the state level, and a county level. And then talk a little bit about fun things that you can do with this data, because it will be released in 1 week on the Association for Religion Data Archives website. So coming full circle already. So adherence. This is the most complete count of individuals affiliated with the congregation. So this goes, most importantly, beyond membership. So this includes members, children of members, and other attendees who are not members. So for instance, in the United Church of Christ right now, we have about 750,000 members, but we have over 900,000 adherents. So these are different types of measures. And as Rich mentioned, sometimes we need to do estimation procedures for some religious bodies depending on whether they provide data to us, and if they do, what data they provide. And so this is either, like we said, provided from the religious institution, which is our preference, but we will try to estimate it because we do try to have the most complete count possible. And so for this particular analysis that I'm going to briefly run you through, we're going to be talking about all adherents, not just those from participating bodies, because sometimes we look at those who directly submitted data, and I'm going to be looking at the data that was submitted as well as our estimations. So real briefly, what does this tell us and what does this not tell us? So as you look at this, remember that this is congregation level data, this is not individual level data. So it has nothing, it does not reference people's personal identification or beliefs. And so this is not necessarily directly comparable with other types of estimates, and I know Rich mentioned Q. So we know about 30% of the population in the US is unaffiliated with a religious group. And so when we look at adherence, those claimed and unclaimed by a religious body, that's different than affiliated and unaffiliated, because we're looking at organizational belonging rather than individual belief or identification. So moving on, some national trends. And again, I know Rich talked a little bit about this. So in the last 10 years, the US has gained about over 300 million population. And adherence-wise, we've gained about 150 million plus adherents. 2010 we had about 300 million people in the population and about 150 million adherents. And the population has grown as well as our adherents. We've gained about 22 million people in the US and about 10 million adherents. I want to note that in our comparisons that we'll be doing, I did have to drop 2 counties for analysis because counties are not necessarily static things, and some counties have actually changed boundaries. Some counties that were just a name change, I was able to raise even in the data set, but it wasn't always a one-to-one correlation, so those two were dropped. But one major thing to note here is that adherence as a percentage of the population has actually remained remarkably stable over the last 10 years. So in 2010, it was 48.8% of the population was claimed by a religious group, and in 2020, it's 48.7%. So one of our major findings is actually that the overall proportion of the population that's identified as a religious adherent in this study has actually essentially remained pretty much the same. So some national trends. So again, both the US population and number of adherents has grown in the last 10 years and at a relatively comparable rate. But one thing to note is that while this percentage of adherents is relatively stable, the distribution of religious groups in the US with which these adherents are affiliated has changed. And we saw some of that in the maps that Rich presented. But some of the main factors that were driving this, as we said, are the growth in independent, non-denominational Christian churches. Again, thank you, Scott, for your data. Growth in non-Christian religious bodies, and the decline in many Christian denominations. So this is our map of percent of the population claimed by all participating religious groups, and this is 2010. And similar but a little bit different, 2020, this is the same. So you can see if you go back and forth between the two, you can see some of the colors have shifted. So the darker population is the higher population ratio, and there's, I think, only 2 counties that had no presence in them in 2020. So somewhere there are 2 counties with no color in them.
Go back again for a second.
Oh, sure. And these maps are available on the US Religion Census website, so if you want to look at this further and by religious group, you can look them up later. So some state trends. So one of the things to note here is I've listed the states with the most population and states with the most adherents. And one big thing to note is that these lists largely overlap, but not entirely. So California and Texas top both the population and adherents, but then Florida's number 3 of population, number 4 of adherents. Pennsylvania, my home state, number 5 of population, not on the top 5 list of adherents. In fact, Pennsylvania has lost proportionally a lot of adherents in the last 10 years, which actually I think relates back to some of what Rich was showing us on counties with population loss, but more on that later. Similarly, the states with the most, or the least population and the least adherents, these also largely, but not entirely, overlap. Also, I have thrown in a few things on here specifically on New England, since we're located in Connecticut, and you'll note that Vermont is on both lists of least population and least adherents, but New Hampshire shows up on our least adherents list. In fact, as it turns out, New Hampshire is the state that has the fewest proportion of adherents of any state in the country. But of course, this isn't just about numbers. This is about population increases. And the reason, though, I'm including both of these is I want to give a sense of scope of some of these states are really large and have a lot of people and a lot of adherents. But some states are pretty large, but they actually have, they've increased quite a bit over time, and then we'll be looking also proportionally. So I'm presenting this in different ways so you can see some of the connections on some of the places where you see continuity, and some places where there's some things that don't show up on other lists. So states with the most population increases and states with the most adherents increase. They look at the same for the first 3, but Georgia actually had a really large population increase in the last 10 years, and then Washington also did. But North Carolina is on the states with the most adherence increases in the top 5, rather than Georgia. As far as decreases, states with the most population decreases, West Virginia, Illinois, Mississippi, Wyoming, and Vermont. And there's not actually as much overlap with the states with the most adherent decreases. So here we see Pennsylvania again. I think Pennsylvania, and I reference this later, had about 700,000 people decreased in adherence over the last 10 years. And then Wisconsin and Iowa also show up on this list with the most adherent decreases. So adherence is a percentage of a population. So this is looking at, if you have a number of adherents and your number of population, what is the overall percentage? So Utah actually has the most adherence as a percentage of a population. And as I mentioned, states with the least adherence as a percentage of population. Here we have New Hampshire. So one thing to note is that this number ranges quite a bit. So we have our upper end, 73% of the population is claimed by a religious body in Utah, whereas it's 27% in New Hampshire. So that is almost a difference of 50%. And you can see there's actually a wide range of percentages across the country. But this, it looks different, and some of the states on here actually surprised me, where some were higher than I expected and some were a little bit lower. But I will also note that here we can see some contrast to some of the previous lists we looked at. We know some of our states are really have population increases and adherent increases. But Texas with all those increases, they're still actually at number 10 with only 55 only, but they have 55%, even though they've had so many increases. And some of this is actually just a function of some of these states just have a lot of population. Some of the interesting things to look at here is that sometimes the numbers can be skewed in one direction or another, depending if you have a really large population or a really small population. And so there's a lot of trends we can go into this. But I'm also going to talk about the difference in adherence as a percent of population 2010 to 2020. So here we can see this list actually looks a lot like some of our population and adherent growth lists. Florida's actually increased the most in their percentage of adherence in the population. So they went from 39% of adherence as a percent of the population to 47%. On the other hand, we have two representatives from New England in the most decreased. So Massachusetts went from 57% down to 49%, and New Hampshire went from 35% to 27%. We can see Pennsylvania on that list, 54% to 47%. And I believe, this might be it's in a couple of slides, so Pennsylvania actually slightly gained in population, but they lost a lot in adherence. And my hunch is, having been from Pennsylvania originally, I think the people that have died in the last 10 years are more likely those that have been affiliated with a religious group, and those that have moved into the state might be less likely to be affiliated with religious groups. That's my own hypothesis, being a mostly lifelong Pennsylvania resident. But these are important factors to consider when you're looking at this data. This isn't necessarily people leaving congregations where there's a lot of demographic factors that actually factor quite a bit into this. So adherent change versus population change. So this is also one thing that this can be positive or negative population loss. Illinois lost a lot of population in the last 10 years. They also lost adherence, but they lost population in a really high ratio compared to the number of adherents. Whereas, let me get Pennsylvania again. Sorry for thinking of Pennsylvania, they're my home state. They lost a lot of population. They gained population a little bit, but they lost a lot of adherence. And so New Hampshire, we noted, now that they're at the bottom of this percentage of adherence, they lost more adherence than they did having a change in population. So this is another way to look at the data. Again, some overlap with other lists, but not entirely. So quick spotlight of New England. Our adherence as a percentage of the population in New England. Rhode Island tops the list of most of the population estimated by a religious congregation. New Hampshire, not surprisingly, at the bottom, based on our previous data. Connecticut, here we're actually in the higher end of this list, though we are at number 3 overall. Difference in 2010 to 2020 adherence as a percentage of the population. Vermont, despite having a low percentage of adherence, has actually gained somewhat in the overall percentage of adherence, whereas Massachusetts has lost the difference is about almost 10%. So overall state trends, some of the states with the most gains or losses of population also had some of the biggest gains or losses in adherence. Some states had an increase in adherence that was almost identical to their population gains. So North Carolina is actually a great example of this. The difference in gain of population and gain in adherence is about the difference of about 10,000. And as I mentioned, though, some states had some very outsized gains or losses. So Pennsylvania gained about 300,000 residents, lost almost 750,000 adherents, whereas West Virginia lost about 60,000 residents, but gained almost 20,000 adherents. So the main takeaway from this is that the story looks very different by state, and is likely impacted by a wide variety of different factors, many of which hopefully you can start exploring through some of the census data that we'll be able to attach to this because this is county level. So I know we are getting close to time, so I've also looked at this some of the county level trends. And we'll see a similar story that we've seen with the states. Sometimes these lists overlap, sometimes they don't. The reasons states can be on here are for very different reasons. So one thing I did want to show you is I did look at this at New England, and I think this kind of gets further into our story. So for every state in New England, I looked at where you have the biggest increases in adherence as a percentage of the population, and where you have the biggest decreases. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that there was no state where the trends all went in the same direction. So one of the things I think is really fantastic about this being county level data is that even looking at a state level is sometimes insufficient to really understand what these overall trends are. I think some of the maps that Rich showed us, we really need to look at this on a county by county level. In some places, your counties are growing from a particular city at a really high rate, and for other reasons, surrounding counties might be losing population. So even though, for instance, we know that Vermont has relatively gained in their percentage of adherence. We had one county that had a difference of 14.1% over 2010. Another county that had a difference of declined in about 10%, almost 9.1%. But note that these numbers can look really different for every single state, and so something else to keep in mind is to look at the data. So, quick into what's next. So while adherence rates are similar to 2020, or summary findings, adherence rates are similar. Where these adherence are has changed. Some of these are driven by population change, as you noted in some of our previous slides we've looked at, but not all of them are. There's differences in there's going to be a lot of change driven by individual religious groups, so that's another big area of analysis for this. And what are some of the ways that you can actually look at this? Important next steps are going to be looking at these impact of changes on individual religious group adherence, on these overall adherence patterns. There's also a lot of different ways to look at this data. Like I said, looking at states makes sense, but only to a point, because some of the county level data within individual states can be so varied. And so I think there's probably a lot of value looking to regions within states and across states. There's probably other reasons that patterns of adherence have changed, and again, Rich mentioned different ways you can connect this data. If anything's county level, you can look at this data with it. And we encourage people to look at this data. So, as I mentioned, this data will be released on the ARDO website in about a week. And so you can download it and connect it to other county level data and do more analyses than any one individual one of us could do. And in the future, we are already looking a little bit to the 2030 US Religion Census. We're hoping for increased participation and continued inclusion of the groups. We anticipate seeing some post-pandemic changes. Note that this is 2020 data, and we know what happened in 2020. So we would expect that data is probably impacted by the pandemic. And also, I think one of the things we'll need to start thinking about is what's the impact of virtual congregational engagement on adherence rates. And that's a really big conversation that I'm not going to get into now because I could talk about that for another 20 minutes. But something else to think about. So thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
As you can see, the best laid plans, schedules, sort of. We don't really have good time for questions because I believe the food has come, but we do have a long period of lunchtime. So please